The reading for today is taken from Matthew 2, verses 1 to 12, and I'd have to say this is one of my favorite verses. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod, secretly, called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road.
For the past couple of weeks, I've had several conversations with people. I think probably because we've all been watching those year-end, or year-in-review programs. Conversations about the amount of unpleasantness there is in the world these days, and also about the role of the media and letting us know about that. So let me just speak a quick word in defense of the media as a former journalist myself. The media reports on what is interesting and unusual, because interesting and unusual is what sells ads. So we should be glad that murders and terrible accidents and acts of terror are still so unusual that they make the news. For example, on the same day that 162 people died in that Air Asia crash last weekend, on that same day, an equal number of Canadians died of cancer. But that didn't make the news, because that's not unusual. That happens every day. So the news is about what's new or different, and for the most part, good news is too common, too ordinary to make the news. Still, there's a lot of bad news out there. And I think that the Magi have got something to teach us, something to tell us about good news and bad news. In the Gospel of Matthew, one of the author's interests is in establishing the mission to the Gentiles. And he does so by consistently showing that Jesus was rejected by his own people. That's an ongoing theme in Matthew. And so as Matthew tells this story, the Christmas story, the first ones to come and kneel before the Christ child were not Jewish shepherds, as in Luke's version of the story, but rather these foreigners, these Gentiles, these Magi. We're accustomed to imagining these soothsayers being led by a star as they trek across from their home in Persia to Israel. But that's not what Matthew says happens. Matthew says that they saw the star at its rising and determined from whatever house it was in or something, determined that a new king had been born in Israel. So they didn't follow the star to Jerusalem, which wouldn't make any sense because that was the wrong place to go. They actually just used their common sense. Where would a king be born? Where would you go to find a newborn king? Well, you would go to the capital city. You would go to the palace of the current king. And so that's what they did. And it wasn't until Herod gave them new directions, go to Bethlehem. It wasn't until then that they were guided by the star. And of course, the star doesn't seem to act very much like an actual star. It's hard to imagine identifying the exact house over which a star comes to rest. I read a commentator this week who suggests that perhaps the Magi followed the light of a very bright angel. I kind of like that. The light of a very bright angel led their way. But however we choose to understand this story, the point is that the wise men were guided to the Christ child by faith and at God's direction. That's the point of the story. Now, I'm drawn in this story to the faith and the determination shown by the Magi. They believed their astrological calculations, and they acted on them. That's faith. They set out on and completed a 1,000-mile journey. That's determination. Then, when they thought they had arrived, they were given a real setback. They found out that the present king, Herod, does not have a newborn son, as they assumed he had. And again, they demonstrate both faith and determination. If the newborn king isn't here, they ask, where is he? And so they're told, in Bethlehem of Judea, and so they continue on their journey. Then they see the bright star or the bright angel, whatever it is, and they follow it until it stopped over a house. Remember, in Matthew's story, there's no stable. Mary and Joseph live in a house in Bethlehem. Now you're wondering, some of the imagery that I put up this morning shows the wise men at a stable, and our nativity scene here on the table shows the wise men at a stable. So what's all this stuff about a house? Well, you know, there's what's actually in the Bible, and then there's the stories that we tell each other about what's in the Bible. And this, the story about the wise men going to the stable is just part of the story as we know it, our cultural story. Every nativity scene, every maid, I think, has the wise men at the stable. But I think there's also a place for us occasionally to remember exactly what it is that the Bible says. And the Bible says, a house. Okay. But again, when they arrive there, the Magi trust their faith over the evidence of their eyes. Now, a house is a step up from a stable, but even a house in Bethlehem is an extremely inauspicious beginning for a king. Nevertheless, they kneel before this infant child. They lay down their kingly treasures, and then we're told they go home by a different road. Now, Matthew tells us they were warned in a dream not to go back to see King Herod again, but really, I think they probably had already figured it out for themselves. No self-respecting king in those days would have left his palace and gone to some tiny little village there to kneel down before an infant who would grow up to take his throne away from him. Just it wasn't going to happen. I'm sure that the Magi, when they were in Jerusalem, had heard that Herod had already murdered 3 of his own sons in order to protect his throne. The wise men didn't have to be all that wise in order to go home by a different road. The Magi then were men of wisdom, yes, and faith and determination, qualities that served them well in their day and that I think are much needed in our day as well. There's lots of bad news, and we don't have to look very hard to find it. There is, of course, that Air Asia air crash that I mentioned. And you just have to look at the newspaper or listen to the news. The so-called Islamic State is a horror of repression and cruelty. Africa, despite some good news and some bright spots, remains a sinkhole of suffering. Just as one example, Liberia, with a population of 4 million people, has a total of 50 doctors. The Ebola survival rate in West Africa is at 20%, whereas with good medical care, it could be close to 100%. What else? The secret to peace in the Mideast remains, if I can borrow a phrase from Winston Churchill, remains a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. In Europe, anti-immigrant feeling is on the rise. Hate-filled extremist groups are growing in popularity. In this country, Aboriginal women continue to disappear. The government is all but ignoring climate change. Next door, many of our American friends have already started trying to get another Bush elected to the White House. There's lots of bad news. But let's follow the example of the Magi. Let's concentrate on faith and determination. Let's talk about what's good in the world. In Raleigh, North Carolina, for example, there's a woman named Shirley Ratliff. Shirley works in a bagel shop. She's worked there for 8 years. She serves customers in a bagel shop. She has to ride 3 different buses to get to work every morning. But when Shirley got cancer, the customers in the bagel shop passed around a hat, and they bought her a car. They bought her a car and paid for the license and the insurance so that Shirley can drive to work now. That's just good news. You worried about young people? I don't think we have to. You know, not every young person, not every young celebrity acts like Justin Bieber. I read that Taylor Swift, for example, is donating all the proceeds from her hit Welcome to New York to that city's public school system. You can do that in the States. Actress Amy Adams, when she realized that she was going to board the same flight as an American soldier, arranged to have her seat traded for his. The soldier flew first class. The movie star flew coach. A young man named Josh Lynn gave $100 to a homeless man and then used a hidden camera expecting to follow him to the nearest liquor store. Except the homeless man didn't go to the liquor store. He bought food and he took it back and shared it with others. And to his credit, Josh Lynn gave the man another $100. Good for him. Good news, lots of good news. I think of Malala Yousafzai receiving the Nobel Peace Prize for her work in supporting girls' education. Or Emma Watson, you know, who played Hermione Granger in the Harry Potter movies, addressing the United Nations on women's rights. More good news. Life expectancy in India for women, this just is one example. Life expectancy for women in India is 10 years longer today than it was in 1990. Wow. The number of people living in extreme poverty continues to drop. That's not just a smaller percentage out of a growing population, but an actual smaller number of people living in extreme poverty, even with our larger population. In this country, the crime rate is as low as it's been in 50 years. And there are fewer firearm homicides, yes, including that horror in Edmonton this week, fewer firearm homicides than at any time since 1974. Lots of good news. I found a Chris Hadfield. We know Chris Hadfield, the Canadian astronaut, put out a video YouTube video about making resolutions, and I wanted to share that. It's only a minute and a half long.
We're all moving so fast. Just standing on the equator with the world spinning underneath us, we're all going over 1,000 miles an hour. What if, just for a moment, we stopped? There are problems with everything, and nothing's yet perfect. But that shouldn't be cause to bemoan. That should be cause to achieve. Our world is a better place than we often claim it to be. We're living at an all-time high for health and wellness, and literacy has been sharply on the rise for decades. More people are living longer, and during childbirth, both infant and maternal mortality rates have plummeted in the last century, saving the lives of millions. We've seen a host of horrific diseases completely eradicated, and there are many more for which eradication is underway. We live the way we do because people chose to tackle their problems head on. In 100 years, we've gone from filming the Wright brothers to landing a camera on Titan, a moon 800 million miles away. There are a growing number of organizations and foundations leading the way to research, innovate, and affect change in the world. And partnering together, They're helping the world's poorest people lift themselves out of hunger and poverty. When thinking if you're going to be optimistic this year, remember, nobody changes the world on their own. It all starts with a resolution. What's yours?
Yes, there are problems. Some things are worse than they've ever been, but some things are better than they've ever been. If we have wisdom, if we have faith, if we have determination, then we too, like the Magi of old, may find that we are guided by God, that we are led by the light of Christ, that we reach our goal, that we make a difference, that we avoid trouble by taking another road, that we dedicate our lives and our treasure to the one whose very birth is the good news. Jesus of Nazareth, born in Bethlehem, Emmanuel, God with us, wonderful Counselor, Prince of Peace. Amen.